This is the Craft Equation, where conversations about craft brewing, business, and culture all come together. I'm your host, Cameron, co-founder of Mother Earth Brew Co. Now let's crack one open and get into it. All right, you guys, we are back for the Science of Haze series. We've got Chris Baker here. Chris Baker is our Director of Brewing Operations at Mother Earth. He's been with us for 13 years.
You should remember that.
I should know that one. We're back to get into some of the geekier side of the haze craze. If you have not checked out the first part of this episode, please go back and do that now. Make sure to hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you want to hear from the show. We are, just like last time, because this beer had just come out, we're going to be drinking Motor Skills, our Project X series hazy IPA. This is brewed with Amarillo, Citra, Mosaic, and Nelson at 7.2%. This is our rotating beer and artist series. This label happens to be designed by Mid Mind Arts on Instagram. Check him out. He does amazing work. This beer is amazing too. Chris, you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit in the last episode, but this is a really fun hop combination. This is a hop combination we featured in a pale ale that we did for Shreveport Music Fest here several years ago. Every hop in this plays off the other hops. A lot of times as brewers, we work on different hop combos, looking for different flavors. In this case, we were really just looking for like a real synergistic like relationship between them. So again, looking at like Mosaic and Amarillo go well together, Citra and Mosaic go well together, Nelson and Citra go well together, and everything in there plays off another hop, and so you just get this really nice hop flavor out of it. It's a cool beer.
Very cool. The last episode, we dove into what makes a beer hazy from a stylistic standpoint, what people generally expect a hazy beer to look like and taste like, what the BA or the Brewers Association of America defines a hazy beer to be. Fair warning to the listening audience, we are going to get geeky. This is for the beer science nerds, and we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of how these beers get hazy. We are going to talk a little bit about the origin of the style and how they came to be, and then we're also going to talk about some best practices that the brewers out there can use to make sure their beers are made to style, that you're not suffering from some of the things that we experienced back in the day when we first started getting into hazies. The goal here is to be a resource and make sure that anyone here that is consuming or producing hazies is able to do so with some degree of reliability, quality, and that's good for everyone. It's good for the consumer. It's good for the industry. We have no problem peeling back the layers of the onion and exposing the methods. Chris, thanks a lot for doing this. You're going to be doing a lot more talking, I think, in this episode than I am. I haven't been on the brew house in years, and so I'm not quite as tuned in with this style or the methods of producing it that you are. Let's start on the micro level, and I think this is probably the burning question. What is it exactly that makes haze form, and what is haze at its most fundamental level?
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation because we used to see West Coast IPAs that would go hazy, and there's something called chill haze. Chill haze is what happens when a beer is cold. It will begin to show as being hazy. Although it can look a lot like that. Some of the proteins in our malts and polyphenols, which are more like tannins, as if you drink wine and you kind of know what that is, in our hops. And when those two combine together, you get these protein polyphenol hazes that produce chill haze. To add to that, with hazy IPAs, we use a huge fraction of wheat malt, which has more protein than barley. So that produces even more of these polyphenol protein complexes, increasing the haze. So chill haze is defined as something that is apparent when the beer is cold, but disappears when the beer is warm. Hazy IPAs are permanently hazy. They will be hazy whether they're cold. They'll be hazy whether they're warm. They will always be hazy. And a lot of that has to do with, again, that wheat and hop combination. But then the other reality of it is that there are a lot of yeast strains out there that will also contribute to that. It's not necessarily that the yeast is present in the beer. Some beers it is, some beers it isn't, but it's how that yeast interacts with those proteins and those hops to make these compounds more permanent. We as a brewery use a yeast strain called 38 or juice from Imperial Yeast. That's pretty common on the West Coast, and it makes beers hazy. I mean, to that example, we have brewed Buku before, where it's made Buku hazy. It's a combination of factors that end up making it. The biggest one being a massive dry hop, meaning we're adding the majority of our hops after the beer is fermented, and a massive wheat fraction. About 30% of our grain bill is wheat malt. And we blend that with German wheat and American domestic wheat. But that combination in general, around 30% wheat malt, big dry hop. And when I say big dry hop, so for perspective, and most people won't know what this means, but like we dry hop a West Coast IPA around 2 to 2.5 pounds per barrel. We will dry hop a hazy IPA around 4 pounds per barrel. So the hops are way shifted back and mostly in the dry hop. So we end up creating this product that is very hazy. Despite what a lot of people think, our hazy IPAs are so hazy that we even filter them and they are still hazy. We centrifuge them, so we don't run them through like a standard filter, but the haze is so stable that even through a filter, it's still there. I guarantee you, if you pick our beers up off the shelf, our hazy IPAs are never going to go clear. We had that problem early on, and there were practices that made the beers go clearer than we expected. This was something we've worked on over 8 years. At this point, I am so comfortable with where we are at. It's not something I worry about anymore, but early on, our hazy beers, something I worried about a lot.
Yeah, so I just want to define something for those that are listening and watching. What I've asked Chris to help explain is what we're looking at here, which is a like shelf stable hazy product. I'm talking about the style of hazy beer. We're not talking right now about shelf stability issues such as chill haze. Everyone has had the experience where you bring a beer home from the grocery store, chill it down, and then you pour it into the glass. And you've got what we call the snow globe effect, where there's all these pieces of like coagulated yeast or proteins, and they kind of, they actually have weight to them. So they end up settling down at the bottom of your glass. If that's not happened to you, well, congratulations. That's undesirable. But that's not what we're talking about here. That's for a separate episode. So what I'm talking about here is fully suspended, homogenized, opaque beer. So now that that's out of the way, Chris, going back to what you said, what is it that distinguishes making a beer look like this from what I just described? And why were we having that problem at the beginning? Why might other brewers be having that problem when they're trying to create hazy beers? Basically, what's changed?
100%. It's funny. If you go back to the very beginning of this whole thing, we had problems with the snow globe effect when we were in bottles. A lot of that was due to either poor finding practices in our brew house or like use of findings. We use something called findings that help drop excess protein out of the wort or the beer before we ferment it to avoid these kinds of things. And so there was some interesting brewing practices problems we had early on that ended up leading to kind of that snow globe effect. Now, when we started brewing hazy IPAs, we actually went the opposite way where they were too clear. We weren't necessarily having the snow globe effect, but a lot of it was trying to get the beer packaged fast enough when it was hazy to keep it hazy, but it didn't stay that way. And some of that had to do with either not using enough wheat malt or like I used a lot of hops on the hot side of brewing, but I cool pulled them. So when you brew a beer, after you boil it, you transfer it to a whirlpool to separate out the solids. It's kind of like a filter. What we were doing was transferring it over the whirlpool, but on the way there, we were cooling it down from 212 degrees if you're in San Diego down to like, say, 150 degrees so that we didn't extract as much bitterness out of the hops, but we could add a bunch of them. Well, that was cool because the beer didn't get bitter because it's hazy and I didn't want it to be bitter, but it's bad because the hops sequestered a lot of the haze forming proteins out of the brewing side. They would go away once we got to the dry hopping of the final product. Now, the way we brew is we add a lot less hops on the hot side and really focus on a large dry hop to drive the flavors of the beer, which also helps stabilize the haze that's in it. We've gone through every iteration you can think of beers that have been overly hazy or not hazy enough to the point where we've gotten to now. We've realized we tend to cut down on the hops on the hot side. We want some balancing bitterness in our beers, but we focus largely on dry hopping. Early on, I dry hopped our hazies at around that 2 to 2.5 pound per barrel, thinking that was a huge number. And then we moved to 4, and then our haze really stabilized. We also changed the type of wheat malt we were using. We increased the amount of wheat malt we were using. We increased our stabilization time when the beers were cold crashed in the fermenter. And then we even went to centrifuging, which was the icing on the cake. Once we got the combo down, it was much better. One of the most important parts is when we switched to the juice strain from Imperial. That with the other practices got us to a product that ended up producing a really stable haze. But all of these things play into it. You have to have that large protein fraction. You need to have some kettle findings in the sense that you want to remove like malt astringency and bitterness, but you don't want to have so much that you knock out all the protein. When you dry hop it, you get this really stable hazy product. And then on top of that, you want to add a yeast that really holds up to that, really helps produce that haze and stabilize it. It's really interesting because like what's cool about us as a brewery is we've gotten to brew hazies with our house strain, which is a dry English yeast, which is not a hazy strain at all. And then on top of that, we've gotten to brew them with the new hazy strain that, or not new, but the hazy strain that we have. It's interesting to see just how the yeast produce differently. So if I brew with our dry English yeast, the beer will be hazy, but noticeably less hazy. If I brew with our hazy strain, the beer will be obviously the way that it is when you guys see it glass. And so it's really a combination of all factors. And what I've learned in brewing in general is it always is a combination of all factors.
So far, you've obviously yeast strain makes a big difference. Obviously, the malt bill and percentages make a big difference. You talked about hops being added hot versus cold side and the load that goes in during those times. How does recipe development affect, or how do you change your recipe development process or thought process when you design a hazy versus a clean? Can you talk a little bit more about your malt percentages without giving away the farm here? And then the fining
Yeah, for
side,
sure.
is biofine the most effective product to use that allows for both retention of positive haze attributes versus the negative malt attributes?
So when I talk about finding agents in the brew house, at this point in our brewing side, we actually brew hazies exactly like we brew our clears. There's no difference. The big difference is our recipe development. I think right now we're running about 25% wheat malt, 10% oats, and the rest is Pilsner malt. We also use a large fraction of dextrin malts and maltodextrin in our boils.
If you could
The dextrin malts cause
define dextrin malts, just for everyone.
dextrin is a starch. It's a point where starches actually branch out because starches are basically long chains of sugar. A lot of those chains of sugar or starches are branched, and those branch points are called dextrins. And what dextrins basically are is they're unfermentable starches. An unfermentable starch leaves residual sweetness in a beer.
For Saccharomyces.
So the one thing I haven't, yes, and and the one thing I haven't talked about at all is that residual sweetness in a hazy is really important because it provides balance and it provides a less bitter appeal to the drinker. And so we use dextrin malts and a sugar called maltodextrin, which is really just concentrated dextrins, to get the beer to finish a little bit higher on the final gravity and add residual sweetness to the beer, which is something that's also really important. The haze formation, I think that even if our hazes finish drier, that they would still be hazy, but it's more important for how the beer actually finishes overall. To your point, we use 25% wheat, 10% oats, and then we're somewhere in the like 10 to 15% dextrin malt, depending on whatever we're trying to do to get that residual sweetness and the haze that we want out of the malt. And then the other side of the equation of the hops, we don't add hops to a hazy beer until the whirlpool. So the last step of the hot side, and the rest of it is all dry hop. The defining difference between a West Coast IPA and a hazy IPA, other than the fact that one's clear and one's hazy, is that most of the hops are added during the dry hop in a hazy, and at least 50% of the hops are added during the hot side or during the boiling process in a West Coast. Why West Coasts are more bitter, because bitterness comes from hops being added in the hot side, and why a hazy is less bitter and more sweet because all the hops are added on the back end. So that's kind of our process for deriving those. If you use too little wheat, you will end up with a beer that is less hazy. If you use little dextrins, you will end up with a drier hazy IPA, which is fine. And I'm sure there's plenty of good commercial examples out there. The oats are just to give you that nice, round, full mouthfeel, or as you read the BJCP guidelines last time, a little bit fuller. So that low to medium body mouthfeel. So, I mean, it's a combination of the elements. As you look back on it, Kamran, for our company, it's kind of funny to think about Like I jumped out when I started brewing hazes and I wanted to add a bunch of cool pull hops on the hot side to just get this really rich hop character. And what I didn't realize was that was creating a clarification process for my beer that was making my haze less stable. So all of the things matter, but the reality is the basics are small hot side addition, big dry hop and hazies, big wheat fraction, good residual sweetness on the beer. That's going to produce you a hazy IPA that's kind of where you want to be. Then there's a whole long conversation you can go down with how you dry hop. We do a lot of fermentation dry hopping to get more of that biotransformative like kind of character out of our hops to add to the juiciness of a hazy. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and so it sounds like that's a best practice that we've developed over time. Is that correct? So that's not necessarily common knowledge, but I think it's nice to share with folks. On the packaging side of things, for those that don't have access to a centrifuge, that's an expensive piece of equipment. Maybe there's guys using a DE filter. Maybe there's guys on a plate and frame, which would take forever, I can imagine, with something like this. I
Yeah,
would assume at
for
that
sure.
level, it's probably better to just bypass filtration altogether if you're not that worried about shelf stability. Let's say you're a smaller local brewery that is selling most of their stuff over the bar. Would you recommend just omitting that part of the process completely?
No, it's good. I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't cover that earlier. We use biofine or a fighting agent post fermentation, post dry hop to again drop out as much of the yeast and some of the solids that might settle in a can. The reason we do it is to speed up our maturation process so that we can turn the tanks over a little bit quicker because again, we're a little bit bigger brewery. But the reality is that I think, especially if you're not filtering, finding agents are huge because the reality is that you don't want the first pint out of a keg to look different than the last pint out of a keg. You would do the same thing with a West Coast IPA or a lager for that matter, is that you want the beer to be as clear as possible when it goes into kegs. Now, with a hazy, it's not going to necessarily go clear if you've done everything correctly, but you don't want variations in sediment. We've seen this for sure. First pint, first pitcher off the keg looks like mud, and then the end of it is like pushing being clear. You want it to be consistent. And so, yes, we use finding agents, and yes, we use a centrifuge. Plate and frame could be a little rough with a beer like this. DE could be a little bit rough with a beer like this because our centrifuge spins a lot of it out. We don't run it any different than we run Cali Creamin'. It's there to make a really stable product. Our biggest thing with filtration is making sure that every time you open a can, pour it into a glass, get a pint on tap, it looks exactly the same. That's our target, our goal. That's what we want from our products.
Does do higher viscosity beers like hazies present additional packaging challenges on the line when it comes to canning on foam, overproduction of foam, stuff like that folks need to be worried about? Are there any changes that Yeti, our packaging manager, has to consider?
Yep. Yeah, we run our hazies at a lower carbonation spec, not because the beer is hard to package, but to accentuate that kind of fuller mouthfeel. So higher carbonation, if you have a really effervescent product, it's tending to taste thinner on your tongue. And so we are usually shooting for something that's a little more full. So we back the carb off. Not a ton, a tiny amount. But other than that, our packaging is pretty much the same as our West Coast. If anything, our West Coast are probably a little bit trickier. Just maybe the higher carbonation levels, maybe the hot side hopping adds a little bit more foam to them. They tend to be more aggressive foamers. We have great head retention on
Oh yeah.
hazies, but because it's more viscous, the beer foams out slower. So it's almost easier to package. So the hazies are nice. They actually package really well. That foam, again, because of that huge wheat fraction and all the protein, you get great head retention. You get this really thick foam that pushes all your O2 out. So to our conversation last time about like packaging and whether I think that hazies hold up a little bit better than I think West Coast. It also could just come down to the fact that they have better foam. The foam is dense and thick. Therefore, when we cap on foam on our canning line, beers have less O2 in them. But we don't typically have problems. Honestly, the hardest part about packaging our hazies is putting the different labels on them. Labeling cans is a little more effort than we do in our printed cans. But the beer runs great. We don't typically see too many issues
That's
with it.
so
It's actually pretty awesome.
that's so interesting that you said that about the bubble formation and the head retention. I never thought of that. But It's almost like traffic building up on the freeway, right? So you've got a denser column of liquid. If you think about a super highly carbonated Belgian blonde or a Pilsner in a fluted glass, you can see those bubbles racing up to the top, like champagne, versus, like a hazy or a thicker imperial stout or something. They're really taking their time getting up to the top. I wonder if talking caveman science here, if they take less time to get to the top of the glass, then they would, in theory, also take less time to dissipate off the top of the beer, which means that over time they would sort of back up like traffic on the freeway, right? And that allows them to hang around a little bit longer. And then you also have the sugar creating, some lacing and additional surface tension on the inside surface of the glass, which I think probably helps as well.
100%. So that higher, exactly to your point, you now have oats in it and you have a higher finishing gravity. And so therefore you have more surface tension, you have a bit more viscous liquid in general. And yes, you end up with this, it's harder for the bubbles to form. So like you're canning our Pilsner versus Buku, our West Coast versus Project X, they all foam at different rates. And the faster they foam, the harder they are to can. Project X is right in the middle where you get this thick, dense foam that forms slowly. So it's easy to run the line, whereas all purpose, this has to go through the canning line super fast because the foam is going to come up quickly. You cap on it and seal it before it's a low fill. And then you go an Imperial Stout that's barrel aged. You'll see them fill the can and it won't be any foam for a minute. And all of a sudden, it'll be foam growing out of the can. It's harder because you have to slow everything down so you give the foam time to form. So yeah, all of those play into packaging a beer. And I think that's something that Yeti has to fight with on a level. Being brewers and the people that we are, I want my, Pilsner to be carbonated to high hell. Same with my West Coast IPA. And so I'm going to make, those are my fastest, like foaming beers in general. We make his life absolute hell when he has to figure out how to package those. But he loves hazies because they're right in the middle and they kind of run the way that hazy should run, which is middle of the road, very soft, thick foam, easy to keep your dissolved oxygen levels down.
So, Chris, it's funny. We've spent a lot of time talking about positive attributes of brewing and packaging a hazy IPA. I've heard better head retention, better shelf stability, more flexibility with recipe development. Check, check, check. Why is it then, despite all that, this sounds like a brewer's dream come true? Where does the hazy hate come from in the beer community? And I'm not talking about you.
100%.
Like,
no, it's not just me.
Make, what was that? The Trump hat, that said like, make beers clear
make
again.
Make IPAs great again.
Make IPAs clear again.
Yeah, make beers clear again. Yeah.
Why can't two styles just have merit on their own? I don't understand it because it sounds like procedurally, technically speaking, provides you guys a lot of flexibility with regard to brewing the style.
Okay. So this is a wonderful question. And this is the brewer's perspective. Well, at least me and my brewers, at least what I hear on a regular basis. Hazies are great. One, they're really sweet, which if you're a brewer, you drink more beer than the average human. So that higher caloric content does play in. But also like hazies to me do not express the strength of the hop varietals as well as the West Coast does. So hazies, now we can push them and they're nuanced difference for sure. But like if I make a West Coast IPA, if I make a all Citra hazy and I make an all Mosaic hazy, and then I blind tasted them against each other to somebody like just random, I would bet money they couldn't pick out the difference. Whereas if I made an all Mosaic West Coast IPA and an all Citra West Coast IPA, they wouldn't taste anything alike, in my opinion. And this is a really biased opinion because I am a West Coast brewer through and through. I cut my teeth at Stone Brewing Company. They make IPAs. And same with us. I think the reality of it is that personally, I just think that the West Coast IPA is more reflective of the hops that go into it. For those people that don't know, as a brewer, picking your hops and going into the fields and picking which hops you're going to use is really important. So if your beer doesn't show that work, it's a little bit frustrating. I tend to prefer clear, drier IPAs that tend to kind of, again, just exhibit the hop flavor that we are thought like that we meant to put into it. I love this hazy motor skills that has different flavors of those hops in them. But the reality is that I think that hazies in general tend to taste a little too similar to each other. Like you can have completely different hops in them and taste a little too similar to each other than West Coast when they start to go off in different directions. So I think the variety, we talked about the variety of this style. I think the variety in West Coast is bigger and better, but that's a brewer thing. If I walked out into my brewery right now, there would be at least 4 of my brewers who would slap me for saying that. It's not true for all, but you do hear it. Maybe we're the vocal minority. I enjoy the style. I enjoyed getting the science together to make them stay hazy. I enjoy, they're more yeast driven than West Coasts are. Like it's on our list to talk about how we dry hop these. Like you can dry hop hazies in a bunch of different ways. Ferment the beer and wait till it's terminal. And the minute it's terminal, you can throw all your hops in and get a lot of biotransformative effects, which is really cool. Or you can wait till they pass BDK and dry hop them, and you can do it. Even though it seems simple, there are a lot of different ways to do it, and they produce very different results. Controlling hop creep for brewers out there in hazies is kind of a pain in the butt, but it's also a challenge that we get to overcome. They're fun because they provide a counterpoint, but then, preference is preference, man. Like, like I like Pilsners a lot more than I like just standard American style. I like them because they showcase hops, and anything that really showcases our raw materials is important to us. Probably 70% of what we do is just try to find the coolest ingredients to use. So it's nice to be able to flex that muscle and be like, oh man, our mosaic is badass. Check out this beer. And if I brew it and you can't really tell, it sucks. So, and again, I'll just go back to the last thing. They're sweeter. I don't really like sweet beer as much. And so that's harder for me to deal with. I think we've done a good job balancing them, and we're actually working right now on drying out our hazies a little more, but maintaining the balance. And I think as we do that, we'll continue to hone in our dry hopping processes to make them more unique. But I find if I pick up a hazy at our brewery, or I go to Florida and pick up a hazy, that there's a lot of similarities. Every brewery does West Coast IPAs a little bit different. Anyway, that's my rant. It is a very, very touchy brewer topic.
And that's the Chris Baker referendum on hazy IPAs.
Now I can get hate mail from everybody who's like, hazies are the shit.
No.
They're not bad. I wasn't trying to badmouth them. I just prefer.
I get it. Hey,
and now I'm going to get one of those hats that says make IPAs clear again.
Different strokes, as they say. Well,
exactly.
Thanks a lot for going into that. It's a complicated topic. I think we could probably spend a lot more time than we have here to talk about it. What I would encourage listeners to do is, if you have additional questions, post them in the comments, shoot us a note, whether it's a DM on social, email, whatever you want to do. I think it's important to be transparent about that stuff. Our industry has a reputation of being helpful and cooperative, but for whatever reason, there's certain secrets that folks just aren't willing to share. In my experience, this has been one of them. Folks are tight-lipped on. I don't want us to be that. I think it's good for everybody. The whole rising tide floats all boats mentality applies here. By all means, reach out if you guys need help. If you're trying to brew hazies and you need some additional assistance, we're more than happy to help. Make sure you visit the Mother Earth store at motherearthbrewco.com to get your Mother Earth gear. Right here, we've got the 15th anniversary mesh back hat and the patch flannel. Go check those out. Chris, thank you so much. Cheers to you, buddy. That was a great episode.
Cheers.
Clink. See ya.
Clink. Better, bud.
Like what you see? There's more where that came from. Check out our other content or find us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to drop a comment and let us know what topics you'd like to see covered on The Craft Equation.